Part 1. Okay. The north bank of the Orange River, still not named the Orange, but now called the Great River. 12 November 1857. Dusk. An ox wagon stood by a camel thorn tree, the bullocks having been taken to water at the river. The wagon was the only sign of life in the huge expanse of dune-colored desert, its white canvas top marking the position for miles around. Along the river, the green of mimosa trees softened the harshness of the scene. There were 5 people around the wagon, 3 Hottentot servants, a white man, and a white woman. A fourth Hottentot youth was in charge of the oxen, a total of 6 people, then, accompanying the wagon on its journey north. The white man was the Reverend Matthew Parker. He was a man of middle height, with heavy side whiskers turning white and a broad, solemn face. His eyes were blue and watered from the constant glare. His wife Susan was in her 30s, with a plain, scrubbed face and a sturdy, full-breasted body underneath a long black dress. Both were formally clad for the time and place. Like his wife, Mr. Parker wore black, a tailcoat and trousers, covered in dust, a white clerical collar, and a black hat. The servants wore cast-offs, multicolored and frequently patched. "Are you ready, Susan?" he said. "It's time." "Couldn't we have the service out here, Matthew?" It was hot even though it was dusk, and she was dabbing at her face with a towel. The heat reminded her of Georgia, where she had been born. "You know how I feel about that. But it's so hot in the wagon." She spoke with only a slight southern accent, for she had been educated in Boston. "No one said our mission would be comfortable. I'm sorry if I gave that impression." "No, Matthew, you didn't." "Are you ready?" She put down the towel and took up a shiny black straw hat decorated with artificial roses. While she put on her hat, sticking the bun into a bun, he was taking off his. He unfolded a Union Jack, and ran it up a small flagpole at the back of the wagon. "Come along." The servants stood to one side and watched as their master and mistress clambered into the wagon. 2 clothes chests had been placed opposite each other. Mr. Parker sat on one and his wife faced him on the other. "We shall start by singing hymn 425, he said, and he waited while she turned the pages of the hymn book. 1, 2, 3. His hand gave the beat, and the voices carried the words outside. The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. The darkness falls at thy behest. The servants heard the sounds, lost in the immensity of the desert, and felt sad with longing for their homes. "Let us pray," said Mr. Parker, and they knelt by the clothes chests a few feet apart. "O God, our Heavenly Father, listen to our prayers as we journey on thy behalf in this wild land." She watched him as he prayed. Like his whiskers, his hair was going white, and the lines on his face gave it a humorless and often harsh look. Sometimes, when she watched him like this, something inside her quailed at what she had let herself in for. But then she told herself, "He's a good man. I am lucky." She was lucky. She had known she did not have the looks to attract men, And if she had not guessed this herself, she would have eventually come to it through the ordinary but brutal frankness of family life. She was the eldest of 7 children, 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and it was impossible to live in such close contact with people her own age without recognizing their opinion of her. She could see that while they loved her, there was an element of pity in that love. She remembered her father once saying, "You may have to make your own way in the world, Susan. That is why I'm giving you the most precious gift I can, an education." Her family owned a small cotton plantation in Georgia near the town of Centerville. It sounded grand in the mouth, but it was too small to be an economic unit, too small to fight against the big landowners who brought in slaves through Charleston, re-equipping themselves as fast as they could, knowing that the end of slavery was coming, but not envisaging its end as war. Her mother was of Puritan stock from Boston, plain and scrubbed and unadorned like Susan herself. Her father was an Episcopalian and a sometime lay preacher who, like many a Southern slave owner, found himself torn between his wife and his conscience on the one hand, and the facts of economic living on the other. Without slaves, even the few he kept, the plantation would fall into ruin. With them, he found it increasingly difficult to face his God. These dichotomies contrasted abruptly in Susan's life. The cool Puritanism of Boston, where she was educated, with its elegant architecture and homes on Beacon Hill, its civilized living, its closeness to its European roots, and the heat and color and violence of life in Georgia, where existence depended on uneasily on keeping others in servitude. The family was in economic decline when, at a neighbor's home, she met the Reverend Parker. She listened to him preach there and again at the meeting house in Centerville. He spoke about slavery from a viewpoint she had never heard expressed before, which helped to ease her own mind as she watched her father struggle to make ends meet. At the time, the South Carolina Committee on Colored Persons had recommended that the moratorium on the trade be lifted. "What shall we do?" the Reverend Parker asked his congregation rhetorically. "Free all the blacks? How will that help them? Will it help them to starve? To wander the land homeless? Will it help them to watch their children die? To go without religion, shelter, to cower? For that, my friends, is what will happen. No, I say to you that if this be an evil, then it will wither of its own accord. It will die away. It will change gradually. That, above all, is what must happen. Gradual change." For an Englishman, whose country had outlawed slavery years before, to be saying such things came as a tonic to the pro-slavery lobby of Centerville, and helped people like her father, who invited Mr. Parker to preach at his own plantation the following week. He and Susan struck up an acquaintanceship, which ripened into friendship. Her family watched with approval. When he asked her to marry him, it seemed churlish and ungrateful to them. After all they had done for her, to refuse. Now, in the midst of this vast African desert, Mr. Parker was in touch with his God. "We ask not that the way be easy, but that thou should grant us the health and strength to journey along it. Above all, O Lord, we ask that we be in time." When the short service was over, they descended to the stony ground, and in the warm grey dusk he held a second service for the servants. He did this every evening. She thought of her father and her own family in the big decaying drawing room at home. There for evening prayers, and also on Sundays the slaves would gather, kneeling around the walls, singing, praying. True, the family did not kneel beside them, but they were in the same room. There was no real feeling of separation. One God did for both colors. But with Mr. Parker, things seemed different. Months before, soon after leaving Cape Town, she had asked him if they could not have one service for all, and he had replied, "It would not be seemly, my dear. God in his wisdom has seen fit to make us different." Later, as they sat by the wagon eating their supper, he came back to the theme of his prayer. It was one to which he often returned. Would they be in time? For Mr. Parker, this meant would he, as representative of the Royal Missionary Society of London, be in time to gather a harvest of souls for the Lord? "We're late in the field," he said. "The London Missionary Society has its people with the Griquois. The Germans are at Bethany, the Paris Evangelicals with the Basutu. The Boston Lutherans have moved into Zululand. That's why we have had to come so far." When he spoke of his mission, his eyes burned. She only half listened. She sat with her back to the wagon wheel, chewing hard chips biscuit and drinking weak tea made with river water. Matthew was obsessed by his mission. She supposed the reason was because he had such high ambitions, no less than to finish his career as Inspector General of the Royal Missionary Society. That was why he had taken on so difficult an area, the fringes of the Kalahari Desert, hundreds of miles to the north of their present position. Night came quickly, a black sky blazing with stars and an orange moon. She lit the lamp in the tented wagon. They always slept inside for fear of snakes, and she began to brush her hair. It was long auburn hair and her best feature. She heard Matthew undressing outside. Soon he would slide under the mosquito net and say his prayers. Then he would wish her good night, blow out the lamp, and leave her staring into the dark, unhappy and unfulfilled. She brushed her hair and stared at the reflection in the mirror propped up on the clothes chest. In her nightdress and softened by the lamplight, she saw a sturdy young woman with a round face and a short nose. Her heavy breasts pushed the nightdress out in two mounds. "I may not be beautiful," she thought, "but I am still young. Why then? Why?" After a week of marriage, in which nothing had taken place between them, she had thought it might be because of shyness on his part, and one night in bed she had put her arms around him and tried to draw him to her. She had felt him stiffen. "I did not marry you for that," he had said. "Why did you marry me?" She held back anger and disappointment. "If my mission is to be successful, I need a wife. No single man has been appointed to high office in the Royal." The brushing became more vigorous. She heard Mr. Parker at the other end of the wagon. He was ready for bed. She lay beside him and he blew out the lamp. "Good night, my dear," he said. The heat of the night descended on her like a blanket of warm black velvet. Her eyes stared, unseeing, at the roof of the wagon, and a feeling almost of panic came over her as she thought of her future with her husband. She awoke to an unfamiliar mixture of sounds. Shouts, the jingling of bridles, the sound of horses' hoofs on the hard desert floor. Mr. Parker lit the lamp. "What is it?" she said. "I'll see." He pulled on his trousers. "Take the gun." "There's no need for that." She looked through the laced-up opening at the rear of the wagon. 3 horsemen were between the wagon and the servants' fire. The horses were leathered and frightened, and difficult to control. "What's the meaning of this?" Mr. Parker said. They swung round to face him. She saw they were carrying long-barreled guns and swords. Their bodies were crisscrossed with bandoliers, and powder horns hung at the saddles. "Who are you?" he demanded. One moved forward. He was about 30 and dressed in a motley collection of clothing, including the high-collared mess jacket of a British regiment, which still showed remnants of its original braid and frogging. On his head he wore a kerchief tied at the back of his neck, and there were gold rings in his ears. The other riders joined him. They were similarly dressed, but when Mr. Parker held up the lamp, Susan saw that their skins were brown while he was almost white, and their noses were flattened while he was straight. "What do you want?" Mr. Parker said, raising his voice. He turned to the servants. "What do they want?" The servants stood in a frightened clutch near their fire. The horses swung this way and that, backwards and forwards, sawing at the bridles, unwilling to be still. Suddenly, the leader spoke in a language Susan did not know. She thought it might be German or Dutch. "Can't you speak English?" Mr. Parker said. The man pointed to his chest. "Captain," he said. "Captain? You, a captain?" "Captain." He gave emphasis to the last syllable, pronouncing the word captain. "Your name?" "Captain." The man nodded. Then he said, "Meat." "We have no meat, but we have food." He turned to the servants. "Give them food." Captain said something to the other 2, and they dismounted and ate biscuits which they dipped in tea. When they had finished, he said, "Brandfein." "I have no brandy." "Pipe?" There's no brandy or tobacco." Both, as Susan knew, were stowed in one of the chests. They had been brought as trade goods for food. Captain suddenly caught Mr. Parker by the arm and began to shake him. "You give." Susan had been watching with growing apprehension, and now took up the shotgun which hung from hooks under the canopy. It was their only protection. Her brothers had taught her how to handle guns. The gun was kept loaded, and she pulled back one of the hammers. It made a loud click, and was heard by Captain. He turned, saw her for the first time, and took several paces towards her. She drew back the second hammer. They looked into each other's eyes, and something he saw there stopped him. Suddenly, he laughed, flung down the mug of tea, gave an order to the others, and in a moment they mounted up and were gone. Mr. Parker watched them go. Then he turned to her. "I don't think we needed the gun. I was handling it reasonably but firmly." One of the servants said, "They can kill you, master." "I can't accept that at all." "They can kill us all. They are Koranas." Susan felt a chill. She had heard about the Koranas, a tribe of Hottentots who had become border raiders, giving sanctuary to criminals on the run from justice farther south. They were feared all along the river and into the country of the Basutos, on whose cattle they had preyed for years. "We must go back," one of the servants said. "Back? What new nonsense is this? Just because 3 men rode into camp in the dark, would you have me turn them away as Christ was turned away? May I remind you that we are on the Lord's business. Place your trust in Him. Susan slept very little for the rest of that night, and when she and Mr. Parker got up at dawn, they found the servants had gone. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment, nor was she helped by her husband, who walked about in circles, saying, "But it's not possible. They cannot have gone." They searched along the river, calling the servants' names. They found no trace of them, but they did find the oxen. They had been halted to keep them from straying, and the Parkers managed between the two of them to drive them to the wagon. The oxen, 14 in the span, were well trained, and Susan, familiar with working animals at home, managed with her husband's help to yoke them. When they had finished, it was almost mid-morning, and the sun blazed down. "Oh, well now," Mr. Parker said. She glanced at him and was shocked to see how much older he suddenly seemed. "Well now," he said again. It was as though he was waiting for someone, her perhaps, to give him a lead. She was by nature an optimist, and her earlier despair had disappeared. They had food, a wagon, oxen, and were near a river. They would at any rate survive. "Won't you thank God for what we have?" she said, knowing that prayer would ease him. "What? Of course. There is always something to be thankful for, and we have each other." For the first time in their married life, he had something which touched her. "Thank you, Matthew," she said. They prayed together and both felt better. "The question is, which way do we go?" he said. South Africa had changed greatly since Father Francis, Don Manuel, and Barreto had come this way. The most important change was that people had come from Europe and had moved across the land searching for places to farm. Land itself, after the crowded slums of Europe and the religious oppression, had become the Eldorado. The Dutch had founded a colony at the Cape of Good Hope in the mid-17th century. It had been taken by the British, returned to the Dutch, and retaken by the British, who had now held it for 50 years. The descendants of the early Dutch and French Huguenot settlers found the rule from London irksome, and many took their wagons and trekked into the interior looking for unoccupied land where they would be free from the laws of a foreign power. This had an effect on the indigenous people of the country, the Hottentots and the Bushmen. As the whites moved north, they pushed these tribes ahead of them into ever more desolate wastes. The largest single movement of whites was the Great Trek of the 1830s, and by 1857, white farmers occupied land mainly in the center and in the east of the country. The deserts of the northwest, where the Parkers had been abandoned, were still empty except for the occasional white hunter, Hottentot, settlement, or band of bushmen roaming the land in search of game. "I'll not turn back," Mr. Parker said in a firmer voice. "We cannot go. We cannot go north without servants who speak a language of the country." They could not go west, for it was uninhabited desert. Therefore, it had to be east along the river until they came to an area of settlement, 200 or more miles away, where they might be able to recruit servants willing to help them continue the journey to Mr. Parker's mission. They followed the course of the river as best they could, and when, because of the terrain, this proved impractical, they swung inland. They were helped by the fact that good rains had fallen earlier in the year, and some of the shallow pans on the desert floor still held water. Days turned to weeks as they struggled eastward. Once they came across two Griquois Hottentots with a herd of goats and betted a bottle of brandy and tobacco for milk and one of the goats. On another occasion, a small band of bushmen brought their melons in exchange for tobacco. They saw this group of 15 several times. They would disappear for a few days, then return with more melons or ostrich eggs or part of an antelope, which they had shot with poisoned arrows. The Parkers managed to survive in this fashion for nearly 3 weeks. Then one day the Koranas came back. It was the Parkers' practice to start the day early, stop early, about 3 o'clock, and lead the oxen down to the river to water them. This could take 2 or 3 hours depending on how far away they had camped. On this day they watered the oxen as usual, and about 6 o'clock, just as the cooling evening breeze stole over the desert, they made their way back to the wagon. They had left it in a patch of shady camel thorn, and as it was hidden from view, they had no warning of what had happened. The first thing Susan saw was their belongings strewn over the ground. The clothes chests and the food chests had been opened and emptied. Then she saw the three Koranas. Captain was sitting on the tailboard of the wagon, the other two were standing beside it. Each had the remains of a bottle of brandy in his hand. "In the name of God, what have you done?" Mr. Parker said, going forward, his face flushing a deep red. "Matthew, stop!" But it was too late. Mr. Parker had reached the Captain. "Give that back to me at once." He held his hand out like a schoolmaster, waiting for the Koranas to give him the bottle. Instead, Captain put his bare foot against Mr. Parker's chest and pushed. The missionary staggered backwards and fell. Captain reached for his gun. Mr. Parker was getting to his feet when he was struck by a lead ball big enough to bring down an elephant. He died instantly, a look of enormous surprise on his face. Susan had screamed when she saw the gun. She ran to her husband, calling his name. Captain caught her by the shoulder and flung her aside. He said something to the others, who dragged Mr. Parker's body behind the trees and began undressing it. When they returned, one was wearing his black coat, the other his trousers and shoes. His feet were too big for the shoes, so he had cut off the toe caps. The Korana stood in a circle around Susan. For the first time, she could look at them closely. The two brown-skinned men had flattened noses and tight gold hair, but Captain, she realized, must be an Octoroon, for his skin was light and his features European. He was also bigger than the other two. She knew that the end of her own life was near, but what she feared most was the period before her death. Captain took a thin leather thong from around his neck and tied her hands together behind her back. He then tied her to one wheel of the wagon. The three men took the last of the goat which the Parkers had bought and grilled it over a small fire. It was still daylight when they finished and Captain untied her hands. He took off the kerchief that he wore on his head, and his long black hair fell about his face. Then he took off his British mess jacket. He had a smooth, well-muscled body, light yellow in color. He indicated her dress. She knew what he meant, but her strength drained from her. He put his hand into a bodice and ripped the fabric away. She fell forward, and he picked her up by the hair. She stood, dressed only to her waist, covering her breasts with her hands. The other Hottentots stared at her. Breasts were of no interest to them. She knew that if Captain grabbed her again, he would hurt her. I will do it, she said. He seemed to understand, for he allowed her to remove the remainder of her clothing. She no longer tried to cover herself. It was the first time that a man had seen her adult naked body. The two dark-skinned Hottentots laughed and pointed to her pubic hair, which was almost black compared to the auburn of her head, and very bushy compared to the sparsely covered pudenda of their own woman. Captain used her several times that night. He had tied her hands and feet to stanchions in the wagon, although she had no idea of struggling. She had bled badly from the first penetration, and when he saw the amount of the blood, he appeared to be puzzled. Perhaps it was because of this he did not kill her. Perhaps he thought she was already dying. But later, when she thought about it, she wondered if there was not another reason. Twice during the night, the other coroners had wanted their turn with her, but Captain had driven them off. The second time, crouching over her and about to take her again, he had said, "They Hottentots, but I and you, white people." In the dawn, they left, driving the oxen with them and leaving her tied as she had been all night. She was only semi-conscious, for he had been rough with her, bruising her eternally and mauling her breasts. She lay in the wagon as the sun rose, turning it into a bake oven. Sometimes she came to and struggled with the thongs, but they were the sinews of a kudu and immensely strong. In the early afternoon, when she was already suffering from heat stroke and within an hour or two of death by dehydration, the little clan of bushmen arrived to barter for tobacco. She was aware of their small heart-shaped faces as the rear of the wagon and heard their strong clicking speech. They took her down to the river in the shade of the mimosa trees and bathed her. The woman boiled the leaves of the wild olive plant and made a tampon which they inserted into her vaginal. Then they pounded the root of the latifolium and placed it on the scratches and bites on her breasts. The root is red, and when she first saw herself, she thought she had been flayed. It was a day before she could walk. The bushmen were small people, and even the man came only to her shoulders, though she was not above middle height. They wore cloaks of animal skins, and the men carried bows and quivers of arrows, the heads of which were daubed with poison. The women wore almost no clothing, and their only adornments were necklaces made from small pieces of ostrich shell. Constant exposure to the withering sun gave their skins, all but the youngest, the look of crushed leather. Two women took her by the hand and led her past the wagon, past the trees, and pointed at something. It was a dusty heap, and she realized it was all that the animals had left of her husband. One woman made a scratching motion on the hot desert surface, and Susan knew she was being asked if she wanted him buried. She nodded, and they understood. They used horn-tipped digging sticks and made a hole in the riverbed and placed in it what remained of Matthew Parker. They were about to push sand on it when Susan saw that something had been uncovered. She pulled it from the sand. It appeared to be a cross, a kind of crucifix. She could not think where it might have come from, unless a missionary had lost it miles upstream and it had washed down. It was 18 inches high and made of wood, badly scarred by the action of the river stones. Once there had been an inscription on it, but that was illegible now. It seemed so wonderful to her that she had found it there, so direct a sign from the Lord to mark Matthew's death, that she placed a cairn of stones on the top of the bank close to where his grave was and wedged the crucifix into it. stayed with the bushman that day and the following one, and then she returned to the wagon. The clan came with her. She gave them what she could. That night she slept in the wagon. The next morning, the bushman had gone, but outside was a small pile of melons, roots, berries, and bulbs. She realized that, knowing there was no tobacco remaining, they had gone for food for good, and that was a final gift to her. What she did not realize was that it was their custom. So hard were their lives to leave behind the old and the sick in exactly the same way, expecting them to die. She went through her stock of food. The servants had taken some when they left, and the Koranas had looted the remains. But they had missed a small bag of flour and another containing 3 pieces of dried beef weighing about a pound. The gun had vanished, but she found a sharp cutting knife and more cutlery and cooking utensils than she could use. She sat in the shade of the wagon and tried to think things out. There was only one inescapable conclusion. If she was to reach the white settlements, she would have to walk. She cut the wagon sail and made a bag in which to sleep. Then she made another to carry the food, her vestas, a knife, and a cake of soap. She found a pair of Matthew's trousers and one of his shirts and put them on. Among the naked bushmen she had felt no shame, but when she had returned to the wagon, convention had returned with her. At dawn the following day she began to walk east. She had no idea how long her food would last, but anything was better than doing nothing, and she placed her trust in the Lord, who had given her so strong a sign. After 3 days her food was finished, and she began to learn how to survive. She collected frogs, and she found that the finches' nests which hung from the trees could be robbed at night. She took the tiny birds and cooked them over coals and ate them. But at the end of 10 days she was starving. Walking became a greater effort, and she had no rest more frequently, and she had to rest more frequently. She became light-headed. On the 12th day, she knelt by the edge of a pool to drink. She heard a noise in front of her and looked up, and thought she saw a great animal in several parts. It stood in the dappled shade, and when she concentrated, its sections coalesced. Coalesced. It was an ox, but like none she had seen before. It was much bigger than those that had drawn the wagon, of a reddish color, with long curving horns. There was a movement to her right, and she saw a second, and a third. Then she saw a black man with a gun, and the gun was pointed at her. She had been wearing Matthew's hat against the sun, and now she took it off, allowing her hair to fall onto her shoulders. The black man, seeing she was a woman, relaxed, and she crossed the river to him. She wondered what language he spoke. Just then a voice shouted, "Mopedi!" The black man indicated that Susan should follow him up the bank. At the top was a wagon not unlike their own, but in a state of dereliction. The canvas hood had been burned, and some of the wood was splintered. A white man lay on a blanket on the wagon bed. He said something to her in what she thought was Dutch, and she shook her head. "I can't understand." I said, "Who the devil are you?" He did not rise, and she saw that his leg was hurt. The black man, Mopedi, whom she later learned was a Basuto from a country far to the east, made strong black coffee and gave her hard bread rusks, which she dumped into it. The man in the wagon was named Franz Dalport. He was a hunter, and had wandered west from his normal hunting grounds looking for new areas in which the game had not been destroyed. He was anxious to know her story, and she told him everything except of the night she had spent with Captain. something apart from natural modesty caused her to keep that hidden. 3 Coronas? Teleport was a big man with light brown hair streaked by the sun and wind. He had an open, frank face with brown eyes and a sunburned skin. Was one of them not a half caste? Yes. He lifted a gun from his side. Have you seen this before? It was my husband's shotgun. And this? A brooch of mine. The half caste was wearing it in his coat. Do you know them? Don't be afraid. They gave me this. He tapped his leg. And I gave them this. He picked up an elephant gun. The Coronas had come on his camp 2 days before, he said. They were driving oxen on which he could see the marks of yokes, and they wanted to barter one for brandy. He had become suspicious. He had given them a meal from a springbok he had shot and opened a bottle or two. Later in the night, they had attacked him and shot him in the leg. They had burned the wagon's canvas hood, but Dalport had been prepared. He had shot one dead and, he thought, wounded another. By sunrise they had gone, driving their oxen with them. Which one did you kill? She said. The half-caste. She felt her spirit lightened. She cleaned up his wound, which had become infected. What have you put on it? She asked. Dung from the oxen. Goat dung would have been better. She searched for the leaves of the wild olive, the same leaves which the bushman woman had used to heal her, made her pull ties of them and tie them onto the wound. In 3 days the infection had gone, and it was healing, although she thought he would never be able to walk without a limp. That is how Susan Parker met Franz Dalport, who was to become her second husband. She cared for him there at the river, and when his leg was healed, they trekked back to fetch her wagon because it was the better of the two. At first, the plan was that he should take her to the white settlements, but that was before they began to live together as man and wife. In later years, when she thought of her behavior, she was amazed she could have done what she did. Yet she knew the reason. She wanted his sperm inside her. She knew there was a chance she would have Captain's child, but if she slept with Franz, she would erase Captain from her mind. It would never be his child. 2 weeks after she had met Dalport, she began to share his bed, and just under 9 months later a daughter was born whom they named Marie. It was a difficult birth, and she was helped by 2 Griqua women who told her she would never have another child. They were right. During those 9 months, when they drifted across the pristine African desert, once they had become lovers, the journey to the settlements was abandoned. They came to know each other more intensely than either had known anyone before. They camped where there was water. They trekked where they wished. As long as they had food, they were content. Franz, she discovered, was the descendant of the family Dalporter, which had fled French religious oppression in 1699 and had come to the Cape of Good Hope. They had founded a grape farm in the Cape. Then the family had grown, and generation after generation had extended it inland. Franz was a remote cousin of the original landed family, who were the largest wine producers in the Cape. His own family had trekked north in the 1830s when he was a child and had farmed land in Natal. Franz, restless and footloose, had become a hunter. The 9 months of wandering before Marie was born made both Susan and Franz look at the desert with new eyes. They were aware that a family would eventually cause them to become less nomadic, and they began to see possibilities in the land they had missed before. The local Hottentots were able to maintain large flocks of goats which thrived on the barren ground. They based their future on this when Marie was born. At first, they lived in the wagon but then decided to build a house and searched for a suitable site. It had to be near water, so they chose a south facing hillside for the shade near a tributary of the great river. But they needed mud to make the bricks, and the river bottom was sand. Franz knew of a waterhole 2 days' trek away which contained all the mud they would need. They decided to camp at the waterhole. It took them more than 3 months to make the bricks and cart them to the hillside. They made them by shoveling mud into molds and allowing the sun to bake it hard. One day, Franz dug up a leather satchel. He brought it to Susan and they opened it. The outside was sodden and quickly broke up once the sun dried it. But inside was a piece of oiled cloth, and inside that a book. Why, it's a Bible, she said. But what language is it? Franz had hunted elephant in Mozambique and recognized it. It's Portuguese, he said. Look, someone has been writing in it. I wonder what it says. They finished making the bricks and took the last loads to their farm. It was a place more remote than any Susan could have imagined, and yet she was happy. Sometimes in the evening they would walk down to the river and watch the sand grouse fly in to drink. Although the landscape was different, there was something about the soft quality of the warm evening air that reminded her of Centerville and her childhood. If only we could get the water up from the river, we could grow things, she said. One day we will. Sometimes they would talk about the Bible and wonder about it. They thought that finding it was a kind of miracle. Susan remembered the crucifix and told Franz about it, and, this, and they decided to call their farm Portuguese Place. The Bible became their first family treasure. click, 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 click. It's been around. Pop, 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 pop to the top, make it down. Pop, 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 and fall around. Pop, 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 pop. Okay. After living for so long in the wagon, the small mud hut was like a palace. Susan had not been able to visualize the kind of house they would eventually build. But when it was completed, it sat against its slope, as though it had grown naturally from the desert. Franz had built it with the help of a few Hottentots who had come to live nearby, hoping for a share in the white man's riches. For all the additions that were to be made in later years, and the greater comfort achieved, this was the heart of the house. It comprised only a living room and a bedroom. It had no bathroom, no kitchen. Washing was done in the bedroom with a basin and jug that sat on a washstand. The needs of the body were catered for in the early days by the wide open vault. Later, a wooden privy was built over a deep hole. A wooden seat was made with openings of two sizes, one for adults and a smaller one for children, because it was feared that a child might fall through. The adult side was covered by a heavy wooden lid that sometimes held spiders, which Susan hated. Snakes and scorpions invaded the privy from time to time, and it was common practice to open the door with a kick, then stand back to let the wildlife escape. The kitchen was built separately, for cooking had to be done on an fire or in a mud oven. Which was called the stoop. It was raised from the desert floor on mud bricks and ran along the front of the house. It was 10 feet wide and shaded by reeds cut from the river. Much time was spent on the stoop. This was where they ate their breakfast and where they sat as the evening breeze stole over the veldt and cooled the air. One day we will have a grapevine growing here, Franz said, as he put up the trellis in the heat. She brought him a pitcher of water and he drank deeply. You always say that. One day, she said, smiling. One day we'll do this, one day we'll have that. It's true. One day will come. We don't need one day. We have everything. From the veranda, the eye was taken down the hillside of low scrub and reddish earth to the vivid green of the trees growing along the banks of the river. As far as either knew, this river had not been named, and so they called it the Green River. The trees were not big in the way Susan knew trees, but they were fibrous and tough, and grew to a height of 20 or 30 feet. They were unsuitable for planking, but Franz was able to make simple furniture from them. It was during these early months, when they were settling into their house, that Susan began to realize his quality. Physically, he was big, strong, and enduring. His hair and beard were brown, streaked with lighter bands where the sun had bleached them. He looked what he was, a man who could cope with the empty land. She had soon realized that she was better educated and cleverer in bookish things than Franz. His learning had come from his parents, themselves barely literate, and he could read and write with difficulty and was only able to add and subtract. These deficiencies did not bother either of them, for he had little time to read and, in the beginning at least, few animals to count. What he lacked in education he made up for in practical ability. He had built the house without drawing a line on paper, and it had come out square, straight, and strong. It was the same with furniture. He used the planking from his wagon to fashion them a table and the base of a bed. The remainder of the furniture, which comprised only a few chairs and two benches for the stoop, he made from acacia wood, with cut antelope thongs for seats. While he made the furniture, Susan wove rushes to make window blinds. Obviously, there was no glass, and mats for the floor. She used some of the canvas of the wagon canopy to make a mattress cover and stuffed it with sweet smelling leaves. She helped Franz when he needed her, and she looked after Marie. Her short, square body was as enduring in its way as Franz's bigger frame. She had been endowed with large, heavy breasts and had ample milk for Marie. Food was not the problem, she had once emphasized. Living for most of his life in a hostile environment, Franz had learned how to survive from the tribes through which he had passed, and taught her what he knew. The main items of diet were antelope he killed along the river or in the hills behind the house, guinea fowl, partridge, and wild duck. There were ostrich eggs to be had from wandering bushmen. Susan knew Susan never saw her band again, and a kind of coarse-haired long-tailed sheep which the Hottentots bred. What they missed above all was any kind of fat, for the meat was stringy and lean. Occasionally, they were able to make up for this by buying a sheep and letting it fatten on the grass and shrubs or by the river. The fat was hulled in the tails, and then these weighed 6 or 7 pounds. Franz would slaughter the animal, and they would gorge themselves on the fried fat, eating it in lumps until their hands and faces shone with grease. They also musked vegetables, and Susan learned to collect wild garlic and wild onions, melons, the core of aloes, and various berries of which she never knew the names. A diet such as this might have had a deleterious effect on health except for one thing: sour milk, or as Susan learned to call it, sack milk. This they got from their goats, and it was kept in a large leather bag which hung inside the house. As the milk went sour, it thickened like buttermilk. Each day, more milk was added to what was left, and so the souring process was continuous. These early years were the happiest Susan could remember. They were alone in a vast, unexplored land. At first, trekking through it with the Reverend Parker, she had feared it. Now, learning how to live in harmony with it from France, she grew to love it. The heat in summer was intense, but she was used to the sticky heat of Georgia. This dry heat was bearable. Sometimes, on hot afternoons, she would take Marie down to the river, and Franz would join them there, and they would immerse themselves in a long pool with a sandy bottom, which had become known as the breakfast pool, because when they were building the house, they would go there to sit and break their fast. Before servants came to Portuguese Place, they would take off their clothes and be naked together as naturally as children. It was in the crushing heat of midsummer that she realized why Franz had built the house on the slope above the river and not, as she might have expected, down by the water's edge in the shade of the trees. Each evening a small breeze would begin to blow across the veldt, rustling the reeds on the stoop and cooling the air. But down in the river bottom the heat remained, suffocating and claustrophobic. Winters were best. The nights were cold and frosty, but the days were blue and golden and warm at noon. Sometimes the milk in the sack would be frozen. Sometimes a light powdery snow would fall. Sometimes there would be a bitter wind, and she and Franz would build a huge fire in the living room and sit over it. On these evenings, they would use a little of their precious lamp oil, and Franz would talk and plan. One day talk, as she called it, and Marie would sit in a cot and watch and listen. He spoke always of goats and sheep and crops, the latter only if they could somehow manage to irrigate the land near the river. Sometimes she was infected by his one day talk. If we could only get the water, we could grow cotton, she said, remembering the fields of her childhood. I've never seen it, he said, but there must be some way. My father had a pump. Hmm. One day, when we are rich, we will buy one. I don't want to be rich, she said. She meant it. There was nothing which money could buy. There was no shop, no bank, no lawyer, no doctor, no government taxes, only the semi-desert, the river, the trees, the group of Hottentots who lived behind the hills, and Mopedi, Francis' boy, who had hunted with him and who had now taken a wife from among the Hottentots and was living in a hut near the house. None of these people wanted money. Currency was anything that could be bartered. The Hottentots had sheep and goats and scrub cattle. Franz had rifles, shotguns, powder, lead, bullet molds, bandoliers, brass buttons, beads, copper and brass wire, nails, pots, pans, mugs. He bought it for what he needed. As the house grew, so did the farm stock. Soon they had a small flock of sheep, a few goats, and one or two cows that gave milk. But even if money had been of some value, wealth itself had little meaning for Susan. Each day she thanked God for being alive, thanked Him for her man and her child. Each day she prayed and put aside some minutes to sit with the Portuguese Bible on her lap. She could not read it, of course, but she guessed at many of the phrases. It was a talisman that became more and more important to her as time passed. Sometimes she would wonder who had owned the Bible, who had come this way before. Then she would remember Mr. Parker and the coroner, Captain. After what had happened to her, just to be alive was enough. She had been willing to make Mr. Parker a dutiful wife, more than dutiful, for she knew that under her plain and practical exterior there were depths of affection, of passion he had never touched, never even tried to reach. Then had come her brutal awakening with the Hottentot. Had she not slept with Franz within the first weeks of their meeting for a specific reason, she might never have taken to a man's bed again. It was Franz who awakened her in a different way. His masculinity was tempered with kindness, and much of their love making had a tenderness seemingly out of place in the wilderness. And within a few months of being together, she was opening herself to him in a way she could never have thought possible. When she lay with him in the big lumpy bed in Portuguese Place, as the early morning sun stole into the room, and as she planned the day to come, she felt a contentment unknown during her marriage to the Reverend Parker. Her days then had been times to be endured. Now each day, now each was to be lived fully from dawn until darkness sent them to bed. Hold this a moment, she would say to herself. This, this is happiness. Remember it. And then Marie, as she grew older, would run into the room from her bed in the sitting room and would climb into the big bed and snuggle up, and Franz would wake and Susan's day would begin. They lived as simply as three people were able to live. Twice a year, they would take the wagon and journey north to the small mission station of Griqua town, where they had been married. There was no shop, but supplies of food were housed there, and they would barter for flour and rice and the occasional simple household item. For the rest, they made do with what they had. It was a way of life at once attractive and fraught with problems. One morning in autumn, 7 years after they had first come to Portuguese Place, they were having their morning meal on the stoop. Franz had been building a new sheep kraal of river stones, replacing the original one which had been made of cut thorn brush, and he was ravenously hungry. But when he came to eat the boiled venison heated up from the night before, he put down his spoon and said, Lord, but I'm tired of meat. I know. I would give my right hand for a pot of coffee. And a bar of soap. I'd make some, but we have no tallow or caustic. And bread. Oh, for a loaf of sourdough. The supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The lamp oil, the soap, and the rice had all given out, and they were reduced to a diet of meat and whatever felt coarse. The wild food which Franz had taught her was edible, she could gather. Their stock of medicines was also dangerously low. They knew that a visit to Griqua town would not suffice, and they would have to go farther afield. Franz had spoken of the mission village of Galilee, 6 days' track to the southeast, but had shown no willingness to leave the farm. Susan knew why. Although he did not often speak of it, His one-day talk sometimes touched on the fact that he did not know whether or not they owned the farm. He was even uncertain whether in this wild and far-off place he was still under the rule of the British government at the Cape of Good Hope. The second worrying factor was the possibility that one day others would come to live and farm near them. Susan tried to reassure him. There's enough land for everyone, surely, she would say. But the wilderness had an almost mystical value for Franz, and he wished to have it to himself. We will have to go to Galilee, he said, picking at the unpalatable food. But again, no plans were made. Susan had been teaching Marie numbers and the alphabet, and had thought to barter for some simple reading books at Griquas town. But there were none. She began to worry about her daughter and to realize that isolation brought as many problems as benefits. Marie ran wild with the children of the Hottentot servants, and soon was fluent in the Low Dutch, which was the language lingua franca of the country, which Franz also spoke. But Susan could not understand. While Susan could see no fault in this association, she realized that the child would grow up as the Hottentots were growing up, backward and only semi-civilized. It was hard enough to get her to her lessons now. She would grow gradually more willful. Why? Marie would say, her dark brown eyes under the black hair glinting up at her mother. Why must I learn writing? Because you won't grow up to be a lady otherwise. But father can't write. Of course he can. He can't. He can't. He can't. Then came news of a large herd of elephants that was feeding some miles upstream. Susan knew what that meant from the early months when she had lived with Franz as a hunter's wife. It meant ivory. They yoked the oxen and trekked upstream. They stayed with the herd for 5 days. Franz had no horse and had to keep up with them on foot. With his bad leg, this meant he was taxing his strength to the limit, for most of each day was spent in running after the herd, trying to keep up with the animals as they moved along the river. Susan followed as best she could in the wagon so that at nightfall she had a hot meal ready for him. She watched him limp about the camp, drained, smelling of blood and gunpowder, red to the shoulders from cutting out the tusks. She watched the Hottentots descend on the great black bodies that lay near the water. Whole villages were on the move, brought by the prospect of meat. Bushmen arrived. The smell was dreadful, for the paunches were carelessly opened, allowing the gall to pour out. She hated it, hated the killing, the smell of the barbarism. It was the dark side of Africa which she herself had experienced in the wagon with Captain. But when it was all over, Franz had killed 15 elephants, and there was a great pile of tusks on the ground next to the wagon. The mission station of Galilee was so called because it had been built at the edge of a shallow pan, which held water in the rains, and even the worst droughts never quite dried up. It had been founded by the Caledonian Missionary Society of Edinburgh in the 1840s, and now, more than 20 years later, had developed into a small village. At first, there had only been the house which had served both as a dwelling and a church. Then the church itself, a small mud building, had been constructed. And later had come other buildings and small houses, until now there were more than 100 souls living in and around Galilee. It was in softer country than Susan and Franz Dalport were used to. Here there was grass, and a number of small farms had been started in the surrounding hills, growing maize and wheat and rearing cattle and horses. The people were a mixture of races and nationalities. At the center was the Reverend McNabb and his wife, representatives of the Edinburgh Mission. Then there was an Englishman, Mr. Harper, who had opened a store and who sold or bartered everything and anything. Over the door was the motto, "Nothing too big, nothing too small." Mr. Harper had a Hottentot wife and 4 half-caste children. The McNabbs were childless. There were also true Hottentots who lived in mud huts and who had been wooed to the Christian church by Mr. McNabb, but who stayed in the area because Mr. Harper also sold brandy, brought up in half arms from the Cape, for which they had developed a taste. The village normally wore a sun-stricken abandoned air, lost in the hugeness of the dusty plains, but on the day Susan and Franz arrived in their wagon it was bustling. The reason was obvious. A train of a dozen wagons traveling north had stopped to re-victual and were parked in a circle behind the church. Franz had bought supplies in Galilee twice before, but he had never seen it like this. "Where can they be going?" Susan said. "I don't know," he said, with a worried frown. They parked their own wagons beside Mr. McNabb's house. "Why, it's Mr. Teleport," said Mrs. McNabb. She was a short woman with grey hair caught severely in a bun. Her husband joined her. He, too, was short, but his hair was unkempt and hung in grey skeins almost to his shoulders. "And a bairn," said Mrs. McNabb, seeing Marie. "You must be Mrs. Talport. Come away in." The house was larger, but as simply furnished as Portuguese place. The McNabbs gave them tea. Franz held the small cup in his large hunter's hands, and when he thought no one was looking, swallowed its contents at a gulp. Susan watched him out of the corner of her eyes and smiled to herself as she saw a look of satisfaction, almost of wonder, come over his face. It was the first cup of tea they had had for more than a year. They talked about the weather and the persistent drought, and then, when Franz asked about the wagons parked by the church, Mrs. McNabb said, "It's been like this for weeks." "We've never seen the like," Mr. McNabb said. "It's turned us upside down." He poured his tea into his saucer and blew at it because drinking, his lank grey locks falling forward. Before drinking. "Where are they heading for?" Franz asked. "Where? Haven't you heard then?" "We have not spoken to anyone for a long time," Susan said. Marie was leaning against her knees, and Mrs. McNabb said, "Come and have another biscuit." She put her arm about Marie's waist to hold her, but the child twisted away and returned to her mother. She chewed the biscuit, looking at Mrs. McNabb with hostile eyes. "It's all this talk about finding precious stones up on the Vaal River that's done it," McNabb said. "They cannot wait to get there. Some don't even stop here, just push on and on till the bullocks drop. We have never seen the likes, and we have been here 15 years this Christmas." "Precious stones?" Franz said. "Aye, diamonds. Would you believe? It'll be a year ago now. Parents found a pretty stone and showed it to their father, and I'm blessed if it didn't turn out to be a diamond. That started it. We have had scores of wagons going through here since then. It's changed this place so you not know it." "I can see that," Franz said. "Aye, but you wait," Mrs. McNabb said severely. You'll see things you shouldn't see anyway, let alone at a mission. You take care, Mrs. Talport. They had supper with the McNabs and turned in early. As Susan drifted off to sleep, she heard shouting and laughing at the other end of the village, but she was too tired to wonder what it was. The following day, they sold the ivory to Mr. Harper and then spent most of the money he had paid them in his shop. It's a good way of doing business, Franz said sourly to Susan. Mr. Harper was a big, bald-headed man with a forbidding manner. He stood by the door of his shop and watched as his three half-caste daughters did the serving. Susan thought them an attractive but sulky trio. At supper, Mr. McNabb had ex- expatiated at some length on the place the half-castes had found for themselves, or, in his opinion, had not found. Mark my words, he had said. One day there'll be trouble with them. They hate the Hottentots because they're ashamed to have them as forebears, and they hate the whites because they'll never be accepted as whites. There's no place for them at all. The store was full of people, both white and Hottentot, and the Harper daughters served the whites first, making the Hottentots wait. Susan and Franz had spent days making a list of all the things they needed, the purchase of which was made possible by the ivory. And now they spent nearly 40 minutes amassing a pile of goods on the boardwalk in front of the store. Apart from such household necessities as flour, rice, coffee, tea, caustic soda, yellow soap and scented soap, candles, matches, and lamp oil, Susan bought reading and writing books, bolts of printed cotton for dresses and curtains, as well as for barter. She bought yards of elastic, needles, and thread, underwear for herself and Marie, and made Franz buy her underwear, which he was too shy to order from the half-caste girl. It was as though they were equipping themselves anew, and in effect, this was true. For not only had their household supplies dwindled to nothing, but their clothes were in the last stages and could not be repaired. She bought shoes, a dress for herself, and one for Marie, and saw that Franz bought heavy trousers, a jacket, work shirts, and boots. Then they stocked up their medicine chest. All of them, like the Hottentots, were susceptible to fault sores, ulcers that affected the legs and arms, and for this they bought Martin Span bandages and zinc ointment. The diet with almost no roughage meant that they needed extract of senna and Glauber's salts. They bought wine of in Ipecac, Ipecac, of Ipecac in case of colds and coughs, Fowler's solution of arsenic to improve the constitution, alum for use as an astringent, calomel, belladonna, Dover's powder, paregoric, tansy oil, and spirits of nitre to break a fever. The half-caste girl paid little heed when Susan asked for goods, but it was different when Franz presented his list of window glass, tools, and farm implements. She displayed a quote, quotaciousness, which caused Susan to smile and Franz to become awkward with embarrassment. Most of the morning was spent loading the supplies into the wagon, and in the afternoon Franz bought two horses, a stallion and a mare in foal. From one of the nearby farms, they rode them back in the late afternoon. Marie sitting in front of her father on the stallion, her eyes shining, her face alight. "Make him go faster," she said. Franz only held her more tightly with his left arm. You must learn to walk before you can run, he said. I don't want to walk, Marie shouted back over her shoulder. I never want to walk. That evening, Susan said, Have we spent everything? Very nearly. Oh, that was me, I'm afraid. But we were down to bedrock. I'll get us something to eat. No, not tonight. Put on your new dress. We're eating out. Out? Where? There isn't anywhere to go. But he had seen an eating house beyond the church. She put on a white cotton dress patterned with small red roses and did her hair. Marie wore a new dress and Franz put on his new velveteen coat. Susan and Marie walked barefooted to the eating house, and when they reached it, they put on their new shoes. Susan had not eaten in a restaurant for nearly 10 years. The eating house was primitive, a room in a dwelling house with a few tables, but to her it had an air of enchantment. There was a white cloth on the table, and they were given proper napkins of linen. They ate bean soup and followed it with boiled mutton and cabbage, of which Franz had 3 helpings, and then an orange for pudding. Marie had never seen an orange before, and again Susan felt a twinge as she thought of the deprivation which must inevitably become a problem for a daughter. How do I eat it? Marie said. I'll show you, Susan said. I want father to. It was dark when they had finished eating, and they had to pass Harper's store. The lamps were lit, and the place was crowded. Half a dozen Hottentots stood on the steps outside. There was laughter and loud voices from inside. Franz looked through the window and saw that one section of the store was a canteen. More than a dozen whites and half-caste girls were drinking brandy. One of the Hottentots outside came up to them and said something to Franz, who shook his head and took Susan and Marie along the dusty road to the wagon. What did he want? Susan said. He was begging, Franz said. He wanted money to drink, Marie said, for she had understood perfectly. Franz went to check the oxen and the horses while Susan took Marie into the McNabb's house, where they had been invited to have a bath. Unlike the small zinc bath which they used at Portuguese Place in front of the winter fire, this was a large enamel bath, and there was a wood-burning geyser. Susan used some of the new scented soap she had bought and put on her new underwear. They said good night to the McNabbs and returned to the wagon. Franz had lit the lanterns, and Susan could see 2 people standing in the glow. One was Franz, but she could not make out the other. As they got nearer, Marie said, It is the girl from the store. She had her hand on Dalport's arm. Susan saw that she had changed her clothing and was wearing a dress that displayed much of her well-developed bosom. Franz said something in Dutch and shook off her hand as Susan and Marie reached them. The girl turned and looked angrily at the 2 women and said something to Franz, then laughed. Susan was dumbfounded at what happened next. Franz hit the girl across the face with the flat of his hand. It was a heavy blow, and it knocked her to the ground. She sprang to her feet and ran 20 yards, stopped, turned, and shouted something in low Dutch. Then she vanished into the night. What happened? Franz shook his head. What did she say? What did she want? Money. She wanted money. But why did you strike her? He opened his mouth and closed it. It was something she said. She was rude. She said something rude to me. Come, we have an early start. Susan turned to Marie. The child's face was drawn and still. There was anger in her eyes. Whatever had been said, Marie had not liked it, nor had Franz. But there was nothing Susan could do without nagging further, and even then she sensed she would not get the truth. Troubled, she tucked Marie into her blankets. Franz was sitting on the disselboom of the wagon. "Can't you tell me?" she said. He shook his head. "It was nothing. Forget it." Later, when Franz was asleep, she heard Marie crying. "What is it?" she said, lifting the blankets and taking the child in her arms. But Marie, like her father, shook her head. Susan noticed that she was sucking her thumb, something she had not done since she was a baby. Franz drove the bullocks hard on the way back to Portuguese Place. They should have been happy to be going home, but they journeyed in silence for most of the time. Even when they reached the Green River and trekked along the bank towards the farm, Franz's spirits seemed to lift only marginally. 10 miles from home, they came upon a sight which she had feared all the years they had lived at Portuguese Place. A group of 5 white-tented wagons were drawn up near the river, and smoke from their fires rose straight up on the still autumn air. "Perhaps they have lost their way," Susan said. But she knew, and Franz knew, that this was not likely. The track to the north was far to the east of Portuguese Place. No one could lose their way by such a margin. Up, 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 up. Settlers had come to the valley of the Green River, and they became the Delport's first neighbors. The word neighbor in its normal usage has a friendly ring to it, but not as used by Franz Delport. In his mouth, at least at first, it sounded like an expletive, and even in the years to come when the land gradually filled with farmers, he never totally accepted white people. The Hottentots and Bushmen he regarded as part of the land itself, living where he had for so long existed alone, in the sense that the rest of the world used the words these newcomers to the valley were hardly neighbors at all. The nearest to Portuguese place was a German family called Lessing, who had built their dwelling 10 miles upstream, while a second family, the Jordans, lived 10 miles beyond that. For several years, no one came to live on the western edge of Portuguese Place, much to Franz's relief, because the land was drier and harsher there. At first, his way of dealing with the intrusion was to ignore it. As far as he was concerned, the newcomers did not exist, and it was only due to Susan that the relationships were forged at all. She, too, felt a sense of loss at having to share the untouched land, but she was more flexible than Franz. And in any case, life was changing and things were happening which caused her to welcome the new neighbors. In the months that followed their return from Galilee, she noticed a change in Marie. The child no longer seemed so wild, no longer wanted to play continually with the Hottentot children. Indeed, she no longer played with them at all, and she was less intransigent about coming to her lessons. Susan found that she kept much more to the house, and when she was making curtains or doing needlework, Marie would often come and join her. In the normal way, Susan would have been delighted with her company, but she sensed that Marie was not being natural, and that her behavior sprang from other reasons entirely, reasons which Susan did not understand. She seemed to be much on the defense, and while she remained silent for long periods, her temper, when it erupted, was worse than before. Susan noticed another change. Marie became self absorbed to the extent of constantly examining herself physically, and Susan had twice seen her standing in front of the looking glass in the bedroom examining the nipples and areolas of her as yet unformed breasts. Susan knew this to be normal in puberty, and she herself had examined her own body minutely, especially when she had gone through the age of having spots. But Marie had not reached that stage yet. There was something clearly worrying the child, but try as she might, Susan could not penetrate her reserve. What made it worse was that often she would catch Franz staring at Marie with a brooding, unfamiliar expression on his face. Susan was a straightforward woman, Anne found it difficult to endure the air of mystery, and she spoke to Franz about it, not stressing it, but simply wondering aloud, coming at the subject tangent, 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 tangentially, tangentially. What is that word? What is that word? I'm gonna have to look it up. Why had Marie changed? Changed? You've seen yourself how much time she spends in the house with me. She no longer plays with the Hottentot children. It would have stopped sooner or later. But she's still a child. It's not natural. They were sitting on the stoop in the gloaming, and now we stood up and went down the steps. Franz, you imagining things? All girls go through times like this. My sisters did. But Susan was not satisfied. She watched her daughter become more and more isolated. The Lessings had children of Mary's age, and she resolved to get them together. But how was she to manage it? She knew that Franz would never consent. Then, 2 years after the Lessings had come to the valley, an opportunity arose. One wild night, when Franz was away with Mopedi on a trip to Griqua town to barter for flour, Susan was awakened by the noise of galloping hoofs, and then a banging on the door. She lit the candle and opened the door to see a young white boy standing outside in the pouring rain, his hair plastered to his skull. He was tall and gangly, and a few years older than Marie. It was such a strange and unexpected sight that she was nonplussed for a moment. "Who are you?" she said. It took him a moment to catch his breath. "Hans." "Hans?" He pointed upstream. "Oh, Hans Lessing." She had only seen him once or twice and had failed to recognize him. What is it, Hans? Come in. My mother," he said. "She's sick." "What's wrong?" "She was bitten by a snake." "I'll come. Marie, wake up!" They sailed up the mare, and the foal, which was now fully grown, and Hans Lessing got up on his small Basuto pony. The river was a torrent. The boy had nearly come to grief on his way to Portuguese Place trying to force his horse across, but Susan knew a ford where the water was less turbulent and managed to get across without incident. It was past midnight when they reached Saxony, the Lessing farm. The rain was still lashing down, and she could make out very little, but she had been there once before and knew that the house was much like their own. There was a pattern to their lonely, primitive mud-built houses. As she went through the front door, she noticed how clean everything was. There was a dresser on it, stood blue plates from Delft, and burnished copper pans. The furniture itself, apart from the dresser, was much like their own. In the shadows on the far side of the room, she could make out 3 servants sitting against the wall, their eyes large with apprehension. Mrs. Lessing was Mrs. Lessing was lying in the largest of the 2 bedrooms on a big brass bedstead, and Susan realized that it must have come, like the dresser and the plates and pots, all the way from Germany. The Lessing family was crowded into the room. Helmut Lessing, the husband, was cradling his youngest child in his arms, and there were 2 other children, a girl somewhat younger than Marie, and a boy about 5 years old. Lessing rose as she came in and gave the baby to his daughter, Elsa. "When did it happen?" she asked. We have our food," Lessing said. "She goes to call the servants. The snake was maybe by the door at the back." He was a man of medium height, but looked shorter because of enormous shoulders. He was heavily bearded and gave an impression of massive solidity. He spoke with a thick, guttural accent, but his face was gentle and his eyes were the light blue of Saxony skies. His wife was also a big woman with flaxen hair done in two plaits. Her face was lined, prematurely old, and her hands were big and hard like a man's. She tried to smile. "Such a fuss," she said. Susan saw that she was sweating. She had been bitten in the left foot, just above the instep. Like everyone else, she had been walking barefooted, both to save on shoes and to be more comfortable. Her feet had developed soles of hard skin like those of the Hottentot woman. The area around the punctures was mottled in shades of blue, orange, and black. "Have you got the snake?" Susan asked. "Yeah, but I do not know it," Lessing said. Hans brought it in. Lessing held the lamp so she could see. It was about 2 feet long, and she could not make out all its coloring, but it seemed to be mainly brown with zigzag markings. It had been killed by a blow which broke its back, so its head remained recognizable. "Ah, it's a night adder," she said. "That's bad?" Lessing asked. "Better than a puff adder." I think better." She had watched Franz deal with several cases of snakebite, and he had taught her which snakes were dangerous. He killed them on sight as a matter of principle, and so she had had opportunities to study them and learn their names. Night adders were quite common in this part of the country, and their venom was often fatal. She knew that by now much of the poison would have already worked into Mrs. Lessing's body, but she did what she could. First, she tied a bandage above the wound, which would cut off the blood supply. She told Lessing to release the ligature every few minutes or so before retightening it. Next, she asked for the sharpest knife in the house and made 3 deep incisions horizontally across the wound. She sucked the area as hard as she could, spitting out mouthfuls of blood. She asked Lessing to heat a piece of wire in the flame of the lamp until it was red hot. Then she cauterized the wound. Mrs. Lessing twisted and moaned, but her husband held her by the shoulders, leaning his bulk onto her and murmuring in German all the while. Lastly, she rubbed Condy's crystals into the wound and tied a piece of flannel loosely over it. Mrs. Lessing had lapsed into unconsciousness by the time she was finished, and the children had been put out of the room so as not to witness the cauterization, except for Hans, who watched with anxious eyes the pain his mother was enduring. Susan washed the sweat from her face and neck and loosened her clothing. The woman floated into consciousness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now we wait," Susan said. She told the servants to make coffee, and she gave a mug to Helmut Lessing. He took it in silence, deep lines of anxiety between his eyes. She put the children to bed and then sat by the bedside. Mrs. Lessing seemed worse in the morning, and there was a bright red line up her leg showing the cause of the poison. Susan sat with her all that day, sleeping only when Lessing took his turn in the hard chair by the bed. Sometimes they held watch together. Mrs. Lessing was unconscious for most of the time, and often in severe pain. "Is she to die?" he asked. "Are you a Christian?" "Of course." "Then we could pray for her." They prayed in silence, one on each side of the bed, and Susan fell asleep on her knees and woke suddenly, ashamed of herself. But it could only have been for a moment, for Lessing was still bent over his folded hands. By the following night the crisis was over. "She's strong," Susan said. "Yeah, She need to be. They talked more easily now, and he told her how they had immigrated to the Cape of Good Hope 4 years earlier, and had spent some time trying to farm, but they had been raided often by the Coronas. Susan's mouth tightened at the word, and had given up when they had lost all their stock. They had gone on to the Vaal River diamond diggings, where he had practiced his trade as a blacksmith before tracking onto his present farm. Are there many people at the diggings? She asked, remembering the wagons coming through Galilee. Ah, thousands and thousands. God help us. They slept, he on the floor, Susan in the chair. She woke at dawn and saw that Mrs. Lessing was recovering quickly. Her color had returned to normal and she was no longer sweating. The house was quiet. The world was still. Susan had not been outside for more than 48 hours. The rain had cleared away and the river had gone down. Everything was fresh and sparkling. The Lessings had built their house where the valley floor was flatter than a Portuguese place, and they had done something which she and Franz had never done. They had planted crops, and now in midsummer there was a belt of green on the flatlands by the side of the river. It was an amazing sight, for the scrub desert simply ended and the green began, finally merging with the trees along the river. She walked down and looked at the growing crop. It was maize. She realized the amount of work that the Lessings had put in, and she knew why Mrs. Lessing's hands looked as they did. It was always said that the Germans were the hardest workers of all. Good morning, a voice said. Lessing was coming towards her. She's better this morning, Susan said. Yeah, I think so. She'll be all right now. She indicated the maize. You've done well. How do you irrigate it? Irrigate? What is that? Bring water. Ah, I show you. He took her a little way upstream and showed her the dam he had built across the river. It was a primitive wall, but it raised a head of water and enabled him to lead it through his fields. She had coffee and was back with the Lessing, and then prepared to leave. Marie was still asleep, and Susan said, Let her stay. If you need me, send her. She knew perfectly well that Hans could ride as he had done before, but it was a way of helping Marie to know the Lessing children. Good, Lessing said. Hans and also speak too little English. What can I give you? Give me? I must something give. You have come to help us. Neighbors help each other. That's enough. In a way, you have already given me something. An idea. I might try to grow some crops myself. Ah, then I give you maize. It will help. And when he went into the house and brought out a small bag filled with precious seed. Okay, I said okay. I said okay. I said okay. But Franz was not impressed. If this country is good for anything, then it's animals. And he seemed to be right, for his flocks thrived on the harsh feeding. Often she would catch him staring out over land on which sheep were moving, and she would sense an almost mystical feeling of ownership in him. More than once, he said, referring to the stock, a man can never have too many. Marie spent a week at the Lessings, and when Susan went back to fetch her, she found all the children getting on well together. Marie and Elsa seemed particularly close. The young German girl, whose fair skin and blonde hair showed her North European ancestry, followed Marie everywhere, and she was already speaking English more fluently. Hans, although he was only 13, put in a full day on the farm, and when Susan arrived, he was working in the fields with his parents. Mrs. Lessing had recovered and seemed shy in Susan's presence. "I thank you 1,000 times," she said, putting her hand on Susan's arm. "We were lucky that you were so strong, and lucky that the bite was so far from the heart." Franz had said very little when he and Moperi returned from Griquois town to find Marie absent. But when Susan brought her back, Marie was so happy and natural, and bubbling over with what she had done and with plans for more visits, that his eyes seemed to lose their frowning, worried look. Susan found only one aspect disquieting, and that was Marie's treatment of the Hottentot children. Before she had stayed at the Lessings, she had broken the pattern of her friendship with them and had seemed indifferent. Now she was actively hostile. There was one particular Hottentot child, a girl of Marie's own age, with whom she had played endlessly, called Nona. She still occasionally came to the rear of the house to call for Marie, as a dog comes to search out its master. On the first two occasions, Marie had told the servants to tell the child she was busy. On the third, a few days later, Susan was nearby when Nona arrived. She was dressed as usual in ragged cast-offs, and her pale brown skin was dusty. But she had a a- bright, attractive face, and Susan had always liked her. "Get away!" Marie shouted in English, for she rarely spoke Low Dutch now. "Get away from me!" The Hottentot child had not understood the words, but had certainly understood their meaning, and she turned and walked disconsolately back to the huts in the hills behind the house. "That was a cruel thing to do," Susan said. The anger in the child's face drained away and was replaced by her former tight-lipped expression. "I don't want to play with her," she said. "She was your friend." "I don't care." "Don't you ever do that again. Don't make me don't make me ashamed of you." That night Susan told Franz. He shrugged. "It is always the same. White children play with the Hottentots, and then there comes a time when they stop." "It wasn't that," Susan said. "It was the way she did it, like kicking a dog." She was remembering her own childhood in Georgia, playing with the children of slaves. When she was little, her great friend had been Jim, the son of Selina, their cook. She could remember Selina so clearly. Unlike the conventional picture of an ample, contented cook, Selina had been real thin, with a pair of half-lens spectacles on the end of her nose. These were often misted up by steam. On cold winter days, Susan and Jim would spend most of their time in the kitchen helping Selina. "Helping," Selina would say, while the two of them sat at the big table cutting or peeling. "Lord, Lord, if that's helping." And she would go about her business, muttering to herself and trying to see through her misted spectacles, and leave the black boy and the white girl, like a little island, to themselves. She was brisk, but love was there. In summer she would give them sandwiches or a slice of pie or a handful of cookies each and send them out to play. They would have have grown-up picnics down by the river. It seemed to Susan that this was what her childhood had been. Selina and Jim and herself and her family, all warm and loving in the old house. Then she went off to school in Boston, and when she came back for her first vacation, things changed abruptly. She returned to her place at the big kitchen table, But Jim was no longer there, and when she asked where he was, Selina said, He ain't coming no more, Miss Susan. Selina had never called her Miss Susan before, and when Susan had gone to her father to find out what was happening, he had said, You're becoming a big girl now. Things change. Susan had never rejected Jim, nor anyone else for that matter, as Marie had rejected Nona. But she knew what Franz meant now. There came a time when the mixing had to stop. But that was the only small cloud on the horizon. A different sort of life had begun, one that she had almost forgotten. Visits between the two families became regular occurrences, especially by the children. Maria was forever nagging to be allowed to go to Saxony, and from what she could gather, the same was taking place there, and it was Elsa who was putting on pressure to come to Portuguese Place. Sometimes, when the work was light, Hans would be allowed to come too. He was a rather grave boy, serious minded in the German way, taking after his father. He was overjoyed when Franz offered to teach him to hunt. The two would go off together, sometimes camping miles away downriver. They would come back tired and dusty, but happy with the success of the hunt. Sometimes, as Susan watched their growing friendship, she felt a touch of sadness and regret that she had never been able to give him a son. The two families began to spend Christmas together. Until then, the day had passed almost unnoticed at Portuguese Place. But the Lessings kept it in the German fashion and would trek to Galilee in November to lay in supplies for the great day. Saxony would be decorated with mimosa in place of fur, and they would eat lamb and goat instead of carp and goose. But that was the only difference. The spirit of the time was kept intact, and soon it became a tradition that they spent Christmas alternately in each other's houses. More and more Susan was reminded of her own youth as she watched the children opening their presents and being happy together, and it was borne in on her that this was what had been missing. This friendship, this relationship with others. She had needed it. So had Marie, and so, in spite of his own defenses, had Franz. The two families, were the Jordans farther upstream, formed a small community. There was enough variety of personality to give interest, and both the Lessings and the Jordans felt the same way as Franz did about strangers. The one farm had become three, but in a sense, the lives at Portuguese Place had been improved by the change, for now, in sickness, there were others to turn to. Franz found that if he needed an implement made, he could go to the helmet Lessing, and Lessing knew that if they were short of meat, he could come to Franz. Jordan's specialty was horses, and he had a way with them. When they were sick, he knew what to do. Franz had been building up his flock of sheep and cattle, and he now employed 3 shepherds who did nothing else but see that the depredations of hyenas, wild dogs, and jackals were kept to the minimum. There was not much they could do to control lions. Susan still had her bag of maize seed, and she and Franz had several times discussed the possibility of plowing the land near the river and growing maize as Lessing had done. But there was always the problem of water. The river was narrower and deeper at Portuguese Place, and there was no natural position to build it where. Lessing had been consulted, and he had gone up and down the stream and examined the fall and had finally shaken his head and said, You need a pump. Franz looked relieved, and Susan thought she knew why. His life had been nomadic, and like a nomad, his interest had been in stock. He saw his wealth in terms of the numbers of his cattle, sheep, and goats. Susan's memories were of things growing, and she missed them at Portuguese Place. Several months later, on a blue and gold winter's day, Susan was teaching Marie how to hem a handkerchief. Although the night's frost still lay on the ground in the shadow of the house, on the stoop the morning sun was warm. "Your stitches are too big," Susan said. "Here, let me show you." They worked in silence for a while, both absorbed in what they were doing. Then Marie raised her head. "Listen, someone is coming." A figure on horseback rode through the trees, having crossed the ford at the river. "It's Uncle Helmut," Marie said, throwing down her sewing and running to meet him. Children called all adults uncle and aunt, indiscriminately. To the Lessing children, the Dalports were Uncle Franz and Aunt Susan. To Marie, it was Uncle Helmut and Aunt Greta. Lessing got down from his horse but stood at the bottom of the steps. "Hey, you in time for coffee?" Susan said. Yeah, but later, I think." There was a worried expression on his face, and he said, Um, where's Franz? Is something wrong? Maybe. Marie, get father. Sit down, Helmut." She went in and told the servants to bring coffee. By the time she returned, Franz was limping hurriedly round the side of the house. Lessing had brought them disquieting news. His own concern was obvious in the way he spoke, for sometimes he lost his English altogether and substituted German words so that when he finally paused, Franz had only taken in half of what he said, and now he had to go back and ask him questions. "You say that there's been another diamond strike, not at the Val River. Is that right?" "That is so. Much closer to here, but not on a river. No." "I thought all diamonds were found in rivers." "Yeah, I too. But this is a new strike. A different kind of strike. Just in the middle of the desert. No river, no water. There was a man on my farm. He came to look for diamonds. I spoke to him, and he told me of these discoveries. Everyone is rushing there from the river diggings on the Val. Thousands and thousands." They sat back and looked at each other in silence, contemplating the implications of what had happened. Susan could hardly recall a time now when the massive solidity of Helmut Lessing had not just been over the horizon. The days when she and Franz and Marie and the few Hottentots had had the entire world to themselves seemed far away and unregretted, for the friendship of Helmut and Greta had given a new meaning to their lives. This latest intrusion was different. The world was coming to their front gate with a vengeance. It was not necessary for any one of the three to bring up the possibility of taking part in such a scramble, and they would have answered on oath for Peter Jordan as well. They were farmers. They wished to be left alone. "What happened to the man?" Franz said. "I say goodbye." "And he went?" Helmut picked up the coffee cup, which almost disappeared in his large hands, and nodded slowly. "Yeah, I said it would be better if he went." Susan, in spite of the tension she felt, smiled to herself as she imagined the scene. The stranger facing this wild-looking man with the black beard and great shoulders, who might have been quarried from the ironstone of the desert outcrops. That night she and Franz talked it over sitting in front of a blazing fire of camelthorn wood. "What does it mean, father?" Marie said. "Oh, it means the end," Franz said. "The end of all this." He waved his hands, encompassing the farm. "Franz, it's not as bad as that," Susan said. "A man cannot live in his own country anymore without being crowded. Half of these people are foreigners, Helmut tells me. They come from all over the world. But Helmut is a foreigner. Susan said mildly. Won't it mean people? Marie said. And houses and shops? Her eyes had brightened at the thought. Why should you want that? Franz said. Hey, we don't know yet, Susan said. She had wondered herself what it would be like, and had envisaged something on the lines of Centerville, a small, quiet rural town with a grid of streets lined with oaks, trailing Spanish moss. It had not seemed so bad an image, and there might be opportunities for Marie to go to school. Then she had to remind herself that this was not Georgia, but harsh scrub desert where any town would be like Galilee, a sun-stricken conglomeration of corrugated iron and clapboard. Marie had her own room by now. Again Franz had tracked to the mud hole and made the bricks and bolted at the back where they were planning a bathroom and even a kitchen. And once she was in bed, Susan said to try and cheer him up. We're safe here. No one can come onto our land unless we let them. That's the trouble, Franz said. We don't know if it's our land. I'm going to drink a brandy. It was not often he took alcohol, and it gave her an indication of his anxiety. When he sat down again, he said angrily, "And Marie, what is the matter with her?" Any young girl would be interested in something new, Susan said. But why? We have our life here. We have our life. It's the life we want. That doesn't mean Marie will want it too. Franz looked up in surprise. You mean she wants to leave you? Franz, she's only a child. She doesn't think like that yet. But one day she might. She cannot, he said fiercely. She must stay here. She cannot leave. You can't make her a prisoner. You can keep her here against her will. Prisoner? What sort of talk is that? It was not often they argued, but now that the subject had arisen, Susan decided to take it one step farther. You traveled the whole of this land before you settled down. I saw much of America and London and parts of England. What has Marie seen and done? She has us. She has all this. It's not the same. I was going to leave this until the time was right, but I may as well say it now. I think she should go to Cape Town for her education. Cape Town. It was as though she had said Gomorrah. 2 or 3 years will make all the difference. Never. Think about it, Franz. He took another brandy. Then he said, And where do you think we'll get the money? We'll get the money somehow. You always do when you need it. She lay awake a long time going over the conversation in her mind. She was glad that they had spoken, glad the seeds had been sown. Franz always took a long time to get used to a new idea, but once he did, he was amenable. The Lessings were an example. At first, he had treated them as though they were lepers. Now they were the greatest of friends, and he would have been embarrassed if she had reminded him how he had originally felt about them. He would eventually see that Marie's future would be more secure with a good education. There was only one thing that bothered Susan. He seemed to feel a need to protect Marie. But from what? The next few weeks were tense ones at Portuguese Plains. Franz seemed to spend most of the time watching the river crossing and the hills behind the house as though expecting an invading army, and Susan watched Franz. Things were not made easier by Maria's constant questioning. When she could stand it no longer, Susan said, If it's God's will that other people come to live in this country, then it will happen. There's nothing we can do about it. But Don't let's anticipate things. God does not have to look after my sheep and cattle. One day she saw him packing blankets in his saddle bags and cleaning his rifle and checking his bandolier, and she said, "What's happening?" "I'm going to write the boundaries." "How long will you be gone?" A week, a week, maybe. They had marked the boundaries during the first year they had lived on Portuguese plains. They had taken the river as one line, and France had ridden upstream and downstream, built cairns at both stopping places, then ridden into the desert, building cairns wherever he thought necessary. In this way, he had marked out a huge, rough rectangle, one side of which was the river. They had no idea how big the farms were. They had never seen it all, and the area encompassed several ranges of hills, a salt pan, various other pans which filled with water when it rained, a mud hole, the mud hole from which the bricks had been made, and two Hottentot villages. It was immense but so dry and arid that one sheep needed 5 morgen, more than 10 acres, to keep itself alive, and it was now running hundreds of sheep, some goats, and scores of scrub cattle. "Let me come with you," she said. His eyes lit up, and then he frowned. "What about Marie?" She can stay at Saxony. Just the two of us, like it used to be." Marie needed no urging, and the following day Franz and Susan set off. They each rode a horse and took a third as a pack animal. Susan was to remember this week always as one of the best she had ever spent, for there was a poignancy about it, in hindsight, that gave it an added dimension. Nothing was ever to be the same again. For the first few days they rode into the high country, camping at night over a huge fire and sleeping as closely together as they could, for it was cold in the hills. They rode through a tawny landscape under the great blue dome of the sky and a warm yellow sun. On the hilltops in the early morning, the air stung their ears and burned their nostrils. "I had no idea it was so big," she said. "Look around you," he said. "Everything you see is ours." Then they came down lazily to the river and felt the first warm wind of spring. They camped on a sand pit, and Franz caught a yellow fish, and they sat in the sun and ate them. Susan remembered how she had walked along the great river until she had nearly died of starvation, and all the time it had been full of fish, and she had not tried to catch them. The noons were hot now in the confines of the river, and one day, towards the end of the week, as they were making their way home, they came through a gorge and felt the heat from the rocks, and Susan said, "Summer will be here soon." Franz said, "There's a pool. Let's swim." "You go in." "I mean together." They had not done this for many years, not since Marie was a baby, and Susan felt suddenly embarrassed at the thought of exposing her short, square body, now misshapen by hard work. "Come," he said. She put her hand into the water. "It's too cold." "We'll swim together," he said. There was an underlying tension in his voice. She took his hand and brought it to her lips. "Things don't stay the same," she said. "Everything changes. You have your swim, and I'll start a fire. He seemed about to say something more, but she moved away and he said, You're right. It's too cold. The following day, within a few hours of home, they saw a stranger at the water's edge. They came upon him suddenly without warning. He was crouched on the bank with an enameled basin in his hands. It contained gravel and water. He swirled the pan in a circular motion, allowing the water to escape, and then turned it upside down on a rock and sifted through the gravel. Franz and Susan sat like statues watching him. Then one of the horses whickered at the smell of water, and the man looked up. He took in the situation instantly and glanced towards his blanket roll where his shotgun lay. Franz saw the movement and urged his horse forward. Who are you? He said in low Dutch. The man straightened up. He was poorly dressed and appeared to be about 40 years old. Who are you? Franz repeated, this time in English. What are you doing here? Who is asking? The man said. He was thin, with a somewhat rat-like appearance. You're on my land, Franz said. What do you want? The name's Miller. I don't care what your name is. What are you doing on my land? I ain't done nothing wrong. I got a piece of paper that says I can prospect for diamonds and other minerals along this stretch of river. It's my river. What? You own the bleeding water as well as the land? Yes. You ain't God. Look. He had been fumbling in his shirt pocket and now took out a piece of printed paper and handed it to Franz. As Franz took it, Susan saw that his hand was shaking with anger. He did not even look at it, but slowly tore it into small pieces. Here, you can't do that. Now you have no paper. That costs money. Miller had been circling slowly towards his bedroll and the shotgun, but Franz pressed the horse a few steps forward and forced Miller along the river bank. Each time the man tried to move away from the water's edge, Franz herded him with the horse. He had either to swim or keep moving away along the bank. For Christ's sake, mister, he began, as Franz pulled his rifle from the saddle holster. Franz! Susan's voice was shrill. Franz paid no attention. If you come back onto my land, I will shoot you, he said. All right. Miller moved 50 yards upstream and stopped to watch. Franz dismounted, picked up the shotgun and smashed the stock on a rock, then threw the barrel into the river. He lifted the bedroll and tossed it in Miller's direction. 1 hour, he said. It was a bleak homecoming. Susan had been frightened by what she had seen. Not so much for the action itself, but what it meant for the future. Franz was angry and depressed. They had not been home for more than an hour when he said, I'm sending for Helmut and Peter. The meeting took place the following day. Jordan was tall and thin and wore side whiskers. An accident with a horse had hurt his back when he was younger, and he walked with a slight stoop. He was a loose-jointed man with high cheekbones and a sandy look to him. They came with their wives. It was the first time Andrina Jordan had been to Portuguese Place. She was short, fat, and cheerful, and was longing to take Susan aside and talk about household affairs. But things were too serious for that. The six of them sat in the living room and drank coffee, and the men each had a brandy because the situation was grave. Lessing had had 2 more prospectors on his land, and Jordan 3. Franz had been lucky to have had only 1. They have papers, Lessing said. I cannot read the papers. We must have papers too, Jordan said, sipping his brandy. That was the nub of the discussion. They talked for hours, the womenfolk sitting in silence, And gradually, although they went off at tangents, they were always pulled back by one simple fact: did they own the land? If we are here, then we are here, Lessing said. The land is ours. But can we prove it? Jordan said. Have we a piece of paper which says so? He paused, then said, we can chase the people away when they come in ones and twos. But later, they said digesting this. They knew that people would bring government, and government meant pieces of paper. Where I lived before, Lessing said, we registered our land. But first it must be surveyed, Jordan said. I know that much. Then we will have it surveyed, Franz said. But we must get a surveyor. In a diamond rush, you will find thousands of surveyors, Lessing said. That is where they make their money. All right, Franz said. We'll go and get one. Who? Jordan asked. What about you? Francis said to Lessing. I hate such places. All right, I will go myself. The wagon stopped at the top of a rise in France, and Susan looked out on one of the most amazing sights they had ever seen. The whole plain in front of them was dotted with tents and wooden shanties. Everywhere men were digging, black men and white, digging feverishly in spite of the heat of the noon sun, and every now and then the point of a pick glinted in the sunshine as it fell. On the far side of the plain, they could see wagons and carts hurrying to join the roiling ant heap of men already there. Everything spoke of rush and hurry as men ran from one place to another searching for vacant ground on which to dig. My God, Franz said, I've never seen anything like this. They had left Portuguese Place 2 days before, taking with them 2 servants and 2 sheep for slaughter because they did not know how long they would be away. Susan saw a look almost of fear in Franz's eyes. He was right, she thought. Things would never be the same, and a kind of panic swept over her. Let's go back, she said. Let's turn around. A voice said, Good day to you. A man was standing by the wagon. He was dressed in a dark sooty suit, with a brown bowler on his head and a watch chain looped on his waistcoat. He was a plump, fair-skinned man and was covered in dust. Is this the dry diggings? Franz said. The same, sir. It's like the end of the world. Or the beginning, depending on whether you're finding anything or not. And believe me, sir, they're finding stones by the score. I take it you haven't come to dig yourself. No, Susan said. Are these yours? He pointed to the 2 sheep grazing on the dry bush near the wagon. Yes, Franz said. What'll you take for them? Take? I'll give you a 5 each. Franz and Susan sat like pumpkins, hardly able to believe what they were hearing. 6 then, the man said. £6 apiece. Suddenly Susan laughed. It's more money than we have seen in a year, she said. But we haven't much use for money. So I'll make a bargain with you, Mr. Levinson. Levinson of Lewisham, in your old London town. We're searching for a land surveyor. You find us a surveyor, and we'll give you the sheep. For a moment, Mr. Levinson looked at them in disbelief. Is that all I have to do? That's all. Done and done, he said, and he hurried off down the road. his coattails flapping, one hand on the crown of his brown bowler. He found them a young man called Richards, another Londoner, who jumped at the opportunity of surveying 3 farms. They left immediately. As they turned the bullock wagon and began to move away through the dry diggings, they saw a large crowd gathering under an acacia tree. On the trestle table, there were mounds of freshly butchered meat. A hand-lettered sign was pinned to a tree. It said, Levinson's Meat Emporium. Best dry digging mutton. 1 pound, 1 pound per pound. As the wagon passed by, Levinson came from behind the table. He wore a white apron, but his head was still covered by the dusty bowler. His hands were red, and he held a large butcher's knife in his hand. Got any more? He said to Franz. Yes. Where can I find you? Mr. Levinson looked over his shoulder, making sure no one heard. There was a moment of silence. Susan realized what was going through Franz's mind, but the panic she had felt earlier had been replaced by realism. They could not put their heads in the sand like ostriches. These people won't go away, she said to Franz. We've got to be strong enough to live with them. If that means trading, then so be it. Franz said stiffly. He was too confused to reply, so she spoke for him. The farm is called Portuguese Place. Ah, thank you, ma'am. We'll make our fortunes. Shake on it? The 3 of them shook hands. Shaboom barum. Bara 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 boom barum. Bara 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 bara.